Hi folks, and welcome to part one of Privacy Essentials. We're going to jump right into the course here, but first I just want to go over a quick disclaimer and remind everybody that this is a training resource. It's an interpretation and it's meant to be used as a guide where we are dealing with an actual piece of legislation, an act that's in force. If you have any issues, questions, concerns on how it's actually interpreted for you, you should check with a qualified legal professional in your jurisdiction. So today we'll be covering in the first part of the course a few different things. We'll be going over the role of the Privacy Commissioner. We'll be doing an overview of PIPEDA itself and how it applies to various businesses or organizations, why privacy is important, why it's important to Canadians. And then in the second part, we'll be doing the 10 Fair Information Principles, which are essentially PIPEDA's guidelines and how the Act is implemented. And of course, we'll sprinkle a couple goodies in there as well. So in order for us to better understand the Privacy Acts and how they apply to us, it's a good idea to understand who oversees this, like who's in charge. So this is all set in place by the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, or the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. So the OPC, as we refer to it. So they oversee the Privacy Act of 1985 and the Digital Privacy Act of 2015, as well as PIPEDA, which came out in the early 2000s. Some call it PIPEDA. Either pronunciation is fine. So the OPC's core responsibility is to protect Canadians' privacy rights. This is done by conducting investigations. They promote awareness and understanding of people's privacy rights, as well as what their obligations are. They provide advice to Parliament and other guidance on any potential new legislation and how the Privacy Act will impact those. So what is PIPEDA? PIPEDA is essentially an evolution. It started with the Privacy Act of 1985, which sets out how federal institutions and governments have to deal with personal information. So PIPEDA takes that one step further with the modernization of having digital records, for example. In a nutshell, PIPEDA is a federal law, and it sets out the rules for collection, use, and disclosure of personal information in the course of commercial activities. So, like I mentioned earlier, PIPEDA outlines 10 Fair Information Principles, which are essentially the rules, for lack of a better term. So, understanding PIPEDA, we need to understand why this is important to Canadians. So, why is privacy law important to Canadians? And why is PIPEDA important? Well, like any other law, if you break it, there are consequences. So under Section 16 of PIPEDA, the Act actually authorizes courts to award damages. So that could be damages for humiliation, pain and suffering. The list is long. So for example, one of the landmark cases was Chitrikar v. Bell, and it revolved around a non-consensual credit check. Where Mr. Chitrikar's information was used without his consent for a purpose that was not authorized. So in total, he was awarded $21,000. And recently, things have ramped up, and there's been a pretty dramatic shift after the Ontario Court of Appeals recognized intrusion upon seclusion as coexisting with PIPEDA. So for those not familiar, intrusion upon seclusion is a legal principle that states that a plaintiff can suffer damages even though there's no evidence of economic harm suffered. So you don't have to prove that you were injured by this information or humiliated, only the reasonable expectation that you could be if somebody else saw it. So these awards typically range from $10,000 to $20,000 per event. And that does include aggravated damages, punitive damages, fines, penalties. So these can get quite costly. So I get a lot of questions from various people asking, does PIPEDA apply to their organization? And in short, the very short answer is yes, absolutely. So in addition to the three territories, PEPITA applies to almost every business in Canada except Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta. And that's because those three provinces have their own private sector laws that are very similar to PEPITA. But with that said, even in those provinces, any federally regulated business or industry is subject to PEPITA. So that would be things like transportation industry, banking, telecommunications. And of course, anybody who's doing any interprovincial or cross-border trade is also subject to PEPITA. As you can see, this applies to a lot of people. And of course, all three territories are subject to PEPITA as well. So again, to understand what PEPITA is, it helps to know what personal information is. So personal information is anything that can be combined with other information that can identify a person. So this can be a person's age, ethnicity, medical details, religion, driver's license number, income level, credit card. This list is by no means exhaustive. So you can see that this could apply to a lot of pieces of information that you may have. What personal information does not constitute is information that's publicly available on a business's website, for example. So the name and email address of a director of a company or something like that. So why is this important to Canadians, and why should you be concerned about this? So in a recent survey done by the OPC, as we know they love to do surveys, nearly 80% of Canadians responded that they were reluctant to share their personal information given news reports about information being lost or stolen or made public. So very easy case that affected a lot of people. A lot of my friends was the student loan scandal where all their information got leaked. That's a prime example of a big data breach that can affect a lot of people and become very costly. Most clients have refused to provide their information to an organization at some point because they didn't feel safe. And some have chosen, over half have chosen not to do business with a company due to its privacy practices. So this is a real concern of Canadians. And here's why. In surveys done by the OPC, they found that only 65% of businesses are aware of their privacy issues and are taking privacy measures to correct them. And even less, at 43% of small businesses are doing the same. And knowing what we know about the Canadian business landscape, we know that the vast majority of companies operating and making up our business landscape would be small businesses. So they are very exposed. And that's because, like you see on the slide here, a lot of them are small companies and they don't have dedicated resources or compliance officers to have them look after PEPITA or their other security issues. Compliance can be a challenge for them just because they don't have the human resources or the financial resources. And sometimes there's just a skill gap there. So that's the purpose of this course, is to kind of try and fill that gap. Privacy can be very good for business though. 81% of Canadians have said that they would choose to do business with a company because it had good privacy practices. And if you think that just because you're small, this doesn't apply to you, where we are in the world today with the technology that we have, just because you're a small business or a small organization, you can still have access to a lot of information. So what's the likelihood of all of this? So it's real. Last year, in the first half of 2018, we had 4.5 billion with a B records stolen, and that was up 133% over the last year. So it is happening. It's happening frequently, and it's happening in large numbers. If you think we're holding more and more information each day, there's more stuff out there, then basically by that virtue, there's a higher likelihood of something happening. So Stats Canada reported that 1 in 5 businesses had a data breach in 2017, and that number is going up. And of course, since we don't like to be too far from the top, Canada has the second highest per capita data breach cost in the world at $202 per record. And those are just the breach remediation costs. That doesn't include any lawsuits or class actions or anything like that. So that wraps up the first part of this course. We'll be getting into the 10 fair information principles in the next segment, but just to recap, we've gone over what PIPEDA is, who it applies to, why it's important, and who's in charge for administering it. So if you have any questions, feel free to send me a message, send me an email. I'm more than happy to help. Again, thanks. I'll see you in a bit.